We'll see how this goes before I decide whether or not I'm going to post it. The last entry I did, I noticed, got 42 views as of this airing here. And it had to do with Edgar Allan Poe. And what I've noticed is that every time I talk on the subject of Poe, I get a lot more hits than I do on anything else. The Dickens-related posts don't get near as much. And then when I specifically focus on Mathew Franklin Whittier, I get a handful, see? So right now it appears that most of the people are interested in Poe, and they never like the video, and they, with one exception, don't respond. The one exception is very unpleasant. So apparently all of those people are in a defensive posture. So I felt like I needed to address this issue of Edgar Allan Poe specifically. Now, I have to say that I'm not a Poe scholar. I picked up quite a bit about him, where he intersects with Mathew Franklin Whittier. I haven't spent my life studying him the way some of you possibly have. I don't know all the ins and outs and all the evidence about Poe. I do know all of that about Mathew Franklin Whittier, but I've learned quite a bit. And what I'm saying doesn't make sense. It just doesn't register because of the assumptions about Poe. And there's a fundamental problem here, and that is that from my research and from digging into it, what I've determined is that Poe was really a sociopath. I mean, a full-fledged clinical definition sociopath. He was concerned about fame. Not all sociopaths want the same thing. He wanted fame, and he would do anything to get it. And as near as I can tell, he was a flagrant, massive plagiarist who artificially built up his career by falsely claiming all kinds of works. Upon being challenged and not having done so, I went in and looked at every single one of his poems that I could find that was published before 1843, because as near as I can tell, Mathew would have shared The Raven and Annabel Lee with Poe privately, both having been unpublished, in 1842, probably middle of 1842. So I looked at all of Poe's published poems up to 1843, and my conclusion was that he plagiarized about 90% of them. That's a massive amount. I mean, when you think about it, you know, in other words, he built his reputation falsely on other people's work. And one of his main methods was to find grieving widowers who turned out to be pretty decent poets while they were grieving, but who had not been published and had no intentions of being literary figures, and stealing those poems and maybe reworking them a little bit. And there's reasons that I believe that. You can go into my papers and you can find my rationale for these things. I'm not going to give the background on all of this. I just want to get to this paradigm shift that's going to have to happen for people. Because otherwise you can't get what I'm saying if you don't undergo this shift. See, if you don't understand that Poe was a sociopath and an imposter, and that 90% of the work that you assume was written by him was not actually written by him, you can't get it. You know, so Mathew Franklin Whittier himself alluded to Poe being an imposter on at least 3 occasions that I can think of. Again, those are also in my paper. And also his work as a critic was the same way. I mean, he became a critic so that he could artificially leverage himself into a position to take pot shots at people below, and that elevated his perceived credibility, see, his perceived status as an artist. If he could take shots at people, you know, famous people, as though they were below him, that elevated him, see. So that's all he was doing. It wasn't, none of it was sincere, see. It was all an act. It's all a smoke and mirrors show. So I haven't delved so much into Poe's prose, but as near as I can tell, the first piece that he published that he got a prize for, Message in a Bottle, that's not him. He stole that from somebody. It looks like something Mathew would have written, but I have no way to tie it in. The only thing I can say about this is there is or was a method by which plagiarists could get hold of material. And I mentioned this in one of my written blogs. And that is that, let's say you're an author and you submit a piece to a journal, a small newspaper, say, and that newspaper folds or that magazine folds. And this happened very often, and a lot of them would only last for a couple of years or so. And somebody would obtain or purchase, maybe they'd buy out the newspaper, or they'd obtain all of the files of submitted work that didn't get published for that newspaper, and then they would steal it. So, in other words, you submit to one journal and 2 years later you find it coming out in another journal with somebody else's name on it. That happened a lot of times. There's an example with Charles Dickens. There's an example where he did that to somebody. There's an example where that happened to Nathaniel Hawthorne. So this is not just something that happened to Mathew Franklin Whittier. So I would not be surprised if Message in a Bottle wasn't originally one of Mathew's. And one reason I say that is that I have plenty of evidence that in the early 1830s, 1831, 1832, 1833, Mathew was writing in this sort of science fiction-ish style. William Wilson is another one. Scholars love to point to that as a kind of autobiographical piece about Poe's childhood in England. He couldn't have written that because he's a sociopath, and this is a story about someone who has deep feelings of guilt about something. So it's a total mismatch, total disconnect for him. Now, whether Mathew could have written this, I don't know. Mathew was raised Quaker. He did have this kind of moralistic streak as his brother John Greenleaf Whittier had big time. Mathew kind of gradually moved away from that, although he still had that in his personality. So it's possible Mathew had written that. The Atlantis is, to me, a real clear instance. That's got Mathew Franklin Whittier as a young man who was kind of bragging about his scholarship all over it. And there is a trail there whereby it could have been submitted to one paper. That paper was bought out by somebody who moved it to Baltimore and knew Poe and so on. So the Atlantis, I would say definitely was Mathew Franklin Whittier's work. And then Mathew makes an allusion to the gold bug. Not that Mathew wrote it, but his suggestion is that Poe couldn't possibly have written the gold bug because he wasn't that astute when it came to cryptography. So that's at least 4, and there are others. In terms of poetry, I don't think that Poe wrote Al-Araf. I think that he back-engineered it. Apparently he put out a version of it, as I recall, with a whole bunch of notes, detailed historical notes. Well, that's what he did in the philosophy of composition with The Raven. He back-engineered the thing. He went into it and looked up all the references and made it look as though he had written it. See, this is the kind of person you're dealing with. He's a total phony, And the people that caught him have been marginalized. That's the thing. It's not like he got away with it, in the sense that he was never challenged. It's just that the challengers were brushed aside and Poe has been turned into a hero, see? Well, that's not the way it was. Unfortunately, the challengers were correct, and Poe was a sociopath. The Raven and Annabel Lee, I absolutely know, were Mathew Franklin Whittier's. They were not Edgar Allan Poe's work. Just right there, that will give you an idea of what we're dealing with. If you take The Raven and Annabel Lee and then pull out Al-Araf from Edgar Allan Poe's poetry, he doesn't have much left that's really worth anything, And the few that he has left that are worth something may not be his either. So again, it's a total smoke and mirrors act, the whole thing. I don't think I need to drag this out, very long. What do we got, like less than 10 minutes? I think that's about what I need here. It's very simple. It's very hard to swallow, but it's very simple once you get it. Once you have that epiphany and the light bulb goes off, the whole thing clears up and looks completely different. Everything makes sense from the philosophy of composition on. Suddenly his critics were right. Griswold, for example, who was, I think, near as I can tell, Griswold in his eulogy was trying to be kind, and 90% of these pieces were not his. His work as a critic was for the ulterior motive of just leveraging himself up. The reason that Graham rejected The Raven is because he knew that Poe hadn't written it and didn't want to be open to libel, not because he wasn't able to recognize a good piece of poetry when he saw one. And the whole thing changes and everything falls into place. See? Well, that's the big block that keeps people from looking at Mathew Franklin Whittier as the author of The Raven and the author of Annabel Lee. And for the matter of that, the reason that Annabel Lee was never published during Poe's lifetime is because although he had obtained a copy in 1842, it was so deeply personal that Mathew must have threatened him, no matter what the consequences. I will expose you if you dare publish this one. And the only manuscripts, apparently, of Annabel Lee were copies that Poe had made right toward the end of his life when he was apparently preparing to go ahead and get it published. See? So there is a very strange business that I'm sure people will bring out, that Mathew caused to have published a poem on time by Francis Quarles in the Portland Transcript, where apparently he was communicating through that newspaper with the blessings of the editor, his close personal friend, Charles Isley, who, by the way, was an expert in cryptography. And it could be construed as a threat because it says, get ready to meet your maker, basically, is what that poem says. And it was a message from Mathew Franklin Whittier to Edgar Allan Poe directly through the transcript. Now, was Mathew threatening him? Did Mathew know that Poe was getting ready to publish Annabel Lee? Well, Mathew would not have been giving him a death threat, but he would have been putting him on notice in some sense, I think. Now, whether it had come to Mathew's attention that Poe was in fact getting ready to publish Annabel Lee, this is new territory. I haven't written about this. I don't know. It's possible. And Mathew may have published this poem by telling him that, well, I wash my hands of this, because apparently he'd been trying to negotiate with Poe to admit that he'd stolen the Raven, and Poe strung him along. That's what I gather from the various back and forth. And finally, Poe refused, and Mathew said, well, it's on your own head. You know, remember, you'll have to be accountable to God, which, of course, Poe didn't believe in. So Poe might have taken it as a death threat, and that might have influenced his behavior. I don't know. Or it seems to me, A Man for All Seasons, there's something about Thomas à Becket. I remember when I was a kid, I saw this movie, and the king is saying, won't somebody do something about this man? And he may not have intended that his former friend be murdered, see? But nonetheless, that's the way the people around him took it. So it's a long shot, but conceivably somebody else saw this and took it upon themselves. You know, I have no idea. I would guess that Poe took it as a death threat, even though it wasn't. So this will probably come up. Anyway, Annabel Lee did get published after Poe's death with the assumption that it was his poem, and Mathew attached it to one of Abby's stories that he had published for her posthumously in the Boston Weekly Museum. I can't remember if it's directly above or directly below, I think below, one of her stories. And that was by way of tribute and by way of signing Annabel Lee for himself and indicating that it was in fact a tribute to Abby and not something that Edgar Allan Poe had ever written. He did that, no doubt, for posterity. Nobody at the time would ever have picked up on it. It's a real clear message to me based on the other messages that I've seen Mathew leave for posterity, because he did a great deal of this. It's all in my paper. So with that, I'm going to close this. And I don't know what to say. It's like when you champion the truth and when you try to defend someone who's been scammed and everybody believes the scammer is virtuous and doesn't believe in the person who's been scammed, then you end up looking like the bad guy. I can't help it. I have to get through this barrier of disbelief regarding Edgar Allan Poe and Mathew Franklin Whittier in order to preserve Mathew and Abby's legacy, which is my purpose. My purpose is not to destroy anybody else's legacy, My purpose is to preserve Matthew and Abby's, and this is standing in the way.